Hello friends, it's finally time to shake the dust off from these pens and draw some stuff on this channel. I am officially back, and today we're going to be drawing this super beautiful orchids with ink pens. I know they look a little bit complex and difficult to do, and I'm going to do my best to simplify the process so that you can take these tips and apply to any of your botanical drawings, or actually any drawing that you do with your ink pens. These are the materials we're going to be using for this drawing. First, the paper. As you know, I love using Bristol paper for my ink drawings, so this is what I'm going to be using here. Also, I hear you guys in the comments in my previous videos saying that my pencil sketches were really hard to see. The pencil was a little too light, so today I'm going to be using the 09 mechanical pencil by Pentel, which is much darker. I'm also using a plastic razor, and I have the second one here that's thinner, which is super helpful for details. And of course, I'm using ink pens, but clearly I forgot to film them here, so I'm going to show them to you guys in a little bit when we start using them. So let's get started. The first thing I want you guys to know is that no, I am absolutely not drawing this from imagination. I am using a reference picture from Pinterest, and I am a big encourager of using references because this is how you build visual memory, so that one day hopefully we can get to the point of drawing a realistic image from imagination. Until we get there, using a reference picture will massively help you improve your drawing, and especially when it comes to a complex object like an orchid. The orchid flower is just so complex and it's so hard to understand in drawing terms. If you are going for a realistic effect, I highly recommend using a pencil to sketch, because getting the proportions down on paper and the composition of your final drawing will make a huge difference in the end, and I'll tell you more about it in a second. Basically, what we're going to be doing is position the general shape of your flower on paper. You always want to start big to small. Don't focus on a little petal or a little detail from your flower. One way to do this is to observe your object, which is the flower, as if it's a geometrical shape. Do you see any triangle shapes? Do you see any round shapes? Do you see any specific sharp angles? Is there any specific empty space around the flower that has a specific shape? Try to put those shapes on the paper first. Also, if you're working with a reference, a very important reminder is to really stare at your reference for a little bit before you start. Just stare at it. Get to know your reference. Slow down your mind, because this is a long process, as opposed to quickly taking a quick look and putting it down on paper and back and forth like that. The reason why I'm saying all this is because I often see in a lot of your projects that sometimes you guys tag me on Instagram, and I see some of my students from my classes, and they have a really good technique when it comes to the shading and the texture and the more like the fun part of drawing with ink pens. But maybe sometimes like their drawing is a little bit too much to the right on paper, too much to the left. There's like a random empty space on a side, and that alone just makes your drawing look more amateur. Knowing where to put the element on paper so that you have a balanced result is such a simple thing that you can do in the beginning that will make a huge difference. If you're struggling to visualize the shape, my tip for you is to grab your reference, throw it on a free tool like Canva, and then blur the image. Blur it so that you can only see the general shape, the general colors, and try to put that general idea on your paper. Once you have the general shape on paper, we can start moving on to smaller shapes. Start shaping your flower slowly so it starts looking more like a flower. Another tip to get the proportions right is to look at the spaces in between elements. You don't need to just look at the flower, the petals, and the stems. You can also look at the spaces between things. So if there is some flowers that are overlapping each other and there's like a little triangle or like a little square of the wall behind the flower that you can see, you can also use that as a guide to know where to position your lines. Remember to not rush. Take a minute, lift your head from the paper, observe your reference, observe your drawing, and then keep making adjustments if needed. It's very common when you are drawing from a reference to start focusing on specific items, and then when you actually like lift your head from the paper and you look at your reference, you look again at the big picture of your drawing, you see that everything is kind of bending towards one side or something like that. This is why we're doing this with a pencil first, because it's still time to fix it. There's nothing wrong with erasing the thing and changing things, moving things more to one side, even starting over if you have to. I promise you this is a small cost for a very high return in the end. Now, once you have your final sketch, we can move on to outlining with ink pens. I suggest that you use a very thin ink pen for this step, especially if you are looking to create a realistic effect, the less we can see the contour, the better. When you look at a flower, you're seeing a petal, you're seeing the shape of the petal, but you don't really see the contour. You know where it ends, but it's a solid thing without necessarily a contour. I'm going to use a 003. This is the thinnest type of pen I like to use. And one important tip here is that I'm also not using a brand new 003 pen, because brand new pens will release way more ink than used pens. So I'm using a sort of 003 pen here that's releasing just enough ink so that I can outline the drawing, erase my pencil, and know where things start and end without making the contour super defined. Let me show you. Also, can we please have a moment for this fancy little glove I have here? I kind of got these because I often kind of like smudge my drawings. I'm now living back in Brazil and it's pretty warm here. I'm scared I'm gonna ruin my drawings, so I got this little glove. It's a really cheap thing from Amazon. You can definitely get this if you want, but it's definitely not necessary, just a little fanciness, because why not, you know? If you do struggle with smudging, if your hands sweat a little bit when you're drawing, or if you live in a warm country like I do, you can also use just a piece of paper. Make sure it's a clean piece of paper and use that just to support your hand on paper so it's not in contact directly with the drawing. I, of course, don't do this on the videos because I want you guys to see what I'm doing, but I often use this a lot when I'm not filming. Now, moving on, this step is basically just contouring and defining the shape of each element of your drawing with a little bit more detail. So this is the time when you actually care about the actual shape of the petals, the shape of the stem, and any other elements that you can see in your flower. This is where the process really starts to slow down. Of course, you touch an ink pen, time stops. I promise you, you don't want to rush a step, because if your proportions and your shapes are not good, there's no shading or texture you can add to fix it. Unless you're doing this intentionally and the realistic shape and proportions are not important to you. But I'm assuming here that you want to create somewhat of a realistic orchid. So I'm just sharing what I observed over the years and after seeing hundreds of drawings from students. This is basically what you want to have at this stage. When you're done with the outline and you have clear shapes for the flowers, you can erase the pencil marks and we can stick only with the ink from now on. All right, team, the good news is that we have survived the hard part. So this is time to clear the schedule for the day and find a good podcast, maybe some music, maybe a little true crime show to put in the background, because we are going to be here for a hot minute, okay? This is a slow process, as you know. For transparency, this whole drawing took me about 3 hours. And now we're going to do the textures and the shading, which is the fun part. This is where your drawing starts coming to life. For this, I'm going to be using a mix of 003 and 005 pens. Some are more new. They release more ink, so they are good for thicker lines and the darker shadows. And some of them are older, so they are great for the textures and marking the directions of lines on your petals. And it's also great for hatching the lighter spots because they release less ink and help us blend the shadows with the lights. So don't throw your pens away. Old pens are life. Moving on. If at this point you were asking yourself, where do I even start? Where do I put some lines? What do I do? I'm gonna ruin this drawing. You are going to start from the spots where all the little mistakes like to hide, which is in the shadows. Sorry, really silly joke, but it is true that you might make a little mistake in the beginning. You might feel like you're inking a little bit too much, so you might as well start from the shadow parts because you can mask it and hide it as a shadow. You're gonna overlay a bunch of layers of ink anyway. So this is why we always move from shadow to light. Whenever you do a stroke of your pen on paper and you draw a line and you lift your hand from the paper in the end, it goes from dark to light, right? So this is basically what we're doing. We're gonna find and observe our references. We're gonna look at our reference and find where the shadow spots, the dark spots are. And this is where you're gonna start. You're gonna hatch to create these clusters of parallel lines. Depending on how fast or how slow your strokes are, you'll release more ink and have a darker result. And if you move faster, you're gonna end up with thinner lines and a lighter result, but it's harder to control the consistency of the lines. So you're gonna wanna to find a balance. You can also use a little side piece of paper to warm up or practice. Like every time you feel like, oh, no, I'm not really sure what to do, just take a little piece of paper and hatch a little bit. So you're going to build that like confidence in your hand and your pen control. And actually, this is a really good topic for another video. If you guys are interested in a quick tutorial on how to practice pen control and consistency with your lines. I know this is very niche and very nerdy of me on this topic, but if you're interested, let me know in the comments and I'll make a video on it. But anyway, just keep focusing on the dark spots and try to follow the lines and organic shapes of the petals. Just take a good, calm look at the texture of the petals in your reference picture and see if there's any lines you can see. This is honestly what makes orchids so complex to draw for me, because the curves and like the roundedness, I don't know, like the positions of the petals, sometimes it just doesn't really make sense. You don't really know, like, where is this petal even coming from? Where is she going? So this is why we're gonna try to focus on the angles and the lines. Usually these lines that mark the texture of the petals, they run from the base of the flower towards the tip in the same direction that it grows. But since it's curved, you're never gonna see straight lines. Make sure your lines are curved in the right angle, in the right direction. Just look at your reference picture and find these angles. These are the types of lines you're trying to create here. You're going to define the movement and the shape of the petals. And again, if you're not sure where to start, you're going to look for the dark spots, the dark petals, the petals that are behind other petals and that have a shade on them. And you're going to start with them. Over time, we can start layering more ink in certain spots to create the contrast and build a realistic effect. Try to create the lines following the directions. As you can see in my drawing here, there are some actual dark lines that are more of a pattern in my flower. It's just a specific thing on my reference picture. Not necessarily the reference picture you are using will have that. This is not a mandatory thing in an orchid, but the patterns help us define the texture. At the end of the day, these are all lines. We're creating lines and we're placing lines together to create a final effect of a drawing. And if your reference picture doesn't have these kinds of like more complex patterns, you just ignore it and focus on the texture itself. Remember that at this point here, we're not focusing on the shading just yet. We're just creating the texture and the movement to guide our shading later on. So basically these lines are going to let us know how to place our shadows. Just keep doing this until you get to the point where all of your petals more or less have a texture. As you can see here, we are playing with the values. So there are some spots that are darker, some spots that are lighter. And yes, in one way or another, this is the beginning of the shading process. But my focus until this point was finding the directions of the lines. Let's move on to the shading part. And as you know, if you've seen my videos, this is my absolute favorite part, because the more we add the shading and create contrast and the drama that comes with it, the more your flower will pop from the paper. It's just really cool that we are able to do that. I'm always fascinated with this stage of any drawing. And the thing you need to know here is that texture and shading follow a very similar process when it comes to the drawing itself. You're just paying attention to different things. Basically, when you're adding the textures, you're mostly focusing on positioning the first layer of lines in the right directions. In this case, we're doing the exact curves of the petals that will create this effect that it's not flat. So this is what we were paying attention to with the textures. When it comes to the shading, you're actually going back to the first little bit when we were doing the sketching that we were looking to our picture and observing general shapes. Now is the time that you can look at your reference picture and observe the shapes of the shadows. Of course, the shadows blend together, but you're going to, if you do this exercise of blurring the image in your mind, you will see that some spots are going to be darker. Those dark spots, we can actually see kind of a shape, right? Of course, the dark usually blends into the light, but more or less, you can have an idea of these shapes. And this is what we are trying to create. We're going to be focusing on the shapes. We're not necessarily creating this specific shadow on this specific petal. Forget that these are petals. Forget that you're drawing an orchid and focus on the shapes. What the shapes of the shadows and where are they positioned on your space, which is your paper. The other way to play with your brain and how you observe your reference picture is observe where is the light hitting these petals, what really gets your eyes first, and then you can add more layers of lines where it's dark, leaving enough white from the paper, of course, for the light spots. It's also really easy to over ink your drawing initially, and if you end up with a result that's too dark, that's totally fine. Just slowly, as you practice, you're gonna get better at knowing how much ink you should add on paper, and it also takes a little bit of practice to have enough pen control to release less ink from your pen. It is a practice game, so don't pressure yourself, you will get there. Just remember to always follow the line directions you chose when you were adding the texture and use that as your guide. Sometimes it's also really helpful to use a thicker pen like a 01 or a 02 for really dark spots. This will actually bring your flower to life a lot. This makes a huge difference. So if you're feeling like your drawing is looking a little bit flat, I want you to be brave and make your shadows a little bit darker. You're gonna find specific spots. Maybe it's, for example, like when two petals meet each other, maybe there's like one petal that's overlapping on top of another petal, or like right under the flower when you can see the stem, there's usually a very, very dark shadow there. It's basically anywhere in your flower where the light can't hit. The light is absolutely not there. Those spots you can actually ink and let your pen enjoy the connection with that paper and release as much ink as you want and actually make it really dark. You're basically gonna keep doing this process until you get to something like this. So when you are happy with the amount of layers you added, you might notice that a few little spots here and there could use a little extra highlight. Maybe you have a little smudge somewhere, you could fix a little tiny mistake, and this can be done by using white ink. It's basically an eraser for pens, but not quite, because you can't really do much without it being too obvious in large areas. So you can't really fix like a massive mistake, but you can use it in little spots here and there to add a little pizzazz to your drawing. It's really helpful to make the final result a little bit lighter, also in case you feel like your drawing is a little too dark. So you can add some extra highlights just to improve your contrast and make your final result a little bit brighter. Usually, if you have very clear light spots, you will probably end up with a drawing that's a little bit more engaging to look at, because light is usually where your eyes go right away when we look at anything. So it can be pretty fun to intensify the light spots and play with the values. When you're drawing on white paper, you are drawing the shadows. Now we get to draw the lights with white ink, which is pretty fun. To do this, you can use a simple white gel pen for this. They are pretty affordable. You can also use white calligraphy ink with a very thin brush. I personally love this opaque white ink from Copic. It comes with a super thin brush, so it is really perfect because the lines are much thinner than using a white gel pen. I've also tested many different white inks and pens, and I find that this is the one that stays white the most after it dries. Usually with the white gel pens, if you go over a really dark area or if you go like over the black ink, you're still kind of able to see the ink through it when it dries. But this thing here is the best. You actually get a white result in the end. I totally recommend. Final thing I want to tell you guys, I am actually launching an in-depth course on drawing with ink pens soon. If you would like to hear about it, please join the waitlist in the link in the description so I can send you the details very soon once I have more information on it. So sign up on the link below. And this is it, guys. Please let me know in the comments what you thought about this tutorial. I feel like this was super specific, so I'm not sure if it was relevant for you guys. Also, let me know of any other tutorials you'd like to see on my channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye, everyone.